The French and Indian War, which was America's battleground in the 7 Years' War, ended with British victory. Both sides had help from local Native American tribes, but the British had the colonists, who numbered just shy of 2 million. The French had about 55,000 settlers in America. The American colonists fought and died alongside the British regulars. Britain now had all the French territory east of the Mississippi and Florida from the Spanish. But Britain was bankrupt after years of war with France and expected the Americans to pay up. The British had troops overseas to protect the colonies and wanted the Americans to pay for their protection. The Molasses Act had been around since 1733, but it had been mostly ignored, but not any longer. This act taxed Americans 6 pence per gallon of molasses that was purchased from non-British origin. Molasses was a big import in New England, mainly for use in making rum. It took a toll on many in New England. In 1764, British Parliament passed the Sugar Act, and in 1765, the Stamp Act, which taxed nearly all printed materials, newspapers, magazines, paper, documents, and even playing cards. Many Americans were outraged. Only the colony's own legislators could levy taxes, but the British believed that the colonists were British subjects, and they were represented by Parliament and could propose taxes on America. The colonists did not send any representatives to Parliament, so they did not have a vote on their behalf. Many believed that the Stamp Act violated their rights. Patrick Henry wrote the Virginia Resolves. This started no taxation without representation. Massachusetts called for a meeting between the colonies. The Stamp Act Congress, October 1765 in New York. 9 of the colonies were present. They stated their grievances with the Stamp Act, but also claimed their loyalty to the Crown. It wasn't just Americans who were displeased with the Stamp Act. William Pitt defended America's point of view. This is part of his speech. A great deal has been said without doors of the power, of the strength of America. It is a topic that ought to be cautiously meddled with. In a good cause, only a sound bottom. The force of this country can crush America to atoms. I know the valor of your troops. I know the skill of your officers. There is not a company on foot that has served in America out of which you may not pick a man of sufficient knowledge and experience to make him governor of the colony there. But on this ground, on the Stamp Act, when so many here will think a crying injustice, I am one who will lift up my hands against it. In such a cause, your success would be hazardous. America, if she fell, would fall like a strong man. She would embrace the pillars of the state and pull down the Constitution along with her. Is this your boasted peace? Not to sheathe the sword in its scabbard, but to sheathe it in the bowels of your countrymen. Will you quarrel with yourselves? Now the whole house of Bourbon is united against you. The Americans have not acted in all things with prudence and temper. They have been wronged. They have been driven to madness by injustice. In 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed, but it was almost immediately replaced with the Declaratory Act. This act claimed that Parliament had the same authority over America that it had on Britain, and that the Parliament has the authority to pass laws and enforce them on America. Parliament hath and right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. This act infuriated Americans after they believed they had achieved success with the repeal of the Stamp Act. Tensions continued to grow. The Townshend Acts had a large impact on Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts House of Representatives sent King George III a petition asking to repeal the Townshend Revenue Act. They also asked other colonies to boycott British goods by sending the Massachusetts Circular Letter. Lord Hillsborough, the colonial secretary, told his colonial governors to dissolve any assemblies that responded to the letter. The warship HMS Romney was also sent to Boston Harbor in May 1768 as a show of force. John Hancock was a merchant and future founding father, and also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He owned the ship Liberty. It was a sloop, and it was seized by custom officials in Boston on June 10, 1768, on allegations of smuggling. This enraged Boston locals, and they rioted. The custom officials left for Castle William, which would later become Fort Independence. This angered Lord Hillsborough. He ordered General Thomas Gage, the commander in America, to send troops to Boston. He sent 4 regiments. The next year, only 2 remained, the 14th and 29th Regiments. In March 1770, Private Hugh White was guarding the customs house and got into an altercation with a young boy who disrespected his captain, and he hit the boy over the head with his musket. A small crowd formed, which grew and grew in size as word spread about the altercation between the soldier and the young boy. White sent word to his barracks that a mob had formed and that he needed help. 7 men were sent to assist White: Captain Thomas Preston, Corporal William Weems, and Privates Hugh Montgomery, John Carroll, William Macaulay, William Warren, Matthew Kilroy. The men pushed their way through the large crowd of around 300 to 400 people until they reached Private White. They loaded their muskets and got into a formation. Captain Preston ordered the crowd to leave, but they would not. The crowd threw things at the soldiers and insulted them. Some threw snowballs, but others threw rocks and whatever they could find at the soldiers. One of the soldiers, Private Montgomery, was hit in the head and knocked down. He got up and fired into the crowd. A man started hitting some of the soldiers, and the rest fired into the crowd. No order to fire was given. 11 citizens were hit. Crispus Attucks, an African and Native American, is known as the first civilian killed in the massacre. Samuel Gray and James Caldwell were also killed in the volley. Samuel Maverick died the next day. Patrick Carr died 2 weeks later from his wound, and Christopher Monk was crippled and died 10 years later, possibly due to his wounds he received that day. All of the soldiers present at the scene of the Boston Massacre were arrested and put on trial for murder. Future President John Adams was the defense attorney for the soldiers on trial. 6 of the soldiers were acquitted after 2.5 hours of deliberation, and 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. They escaped the death penalty by pleading to a lesser offense. They were sentenced to branding of the thumb in open court. Sheriff Stephen Greenleaf was tasked with the branding of Privates Kilroy and Montgomery. The 2 men would be branded in court with the letter M for murder on the palm of the hand at the base of the thumb. They did this so if the person ever committed another offense, the court had proof with the brand of the past offense. The Tea Act of 1773 was an act to help the British East India Company, who was in financial trouble. Most of the tea that came into America was not British, so the Tea Act would make Americans purchase British tea, which the 3 Townshend duties were paid on. The Townshend duties paid the salaries to the colonial governors and judges in America. The British East India Company would be allowed to sell the tea in America directly. They appointed merchants to receive the tea and then sell it for a commission. This made the smuggled tea even more expensive than the British tea taken directly to America. Americans paid a 3 tax per pound of tea. Some in Britain wanted to get rid of the tax so it did not provoke the Americans further, but the British government did not want to look like they were giving in to the rebellious colonists. The Sons of Liberty used sometimes violent tactics to get what they wanted. They would tar and feather government officials to get officials to resign. The company had 4 ships sent to America. 600,000 pounds of tea. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston would all receive ships filled with British tea. The Sons of Liberty used the no taxation without representation argument to go against the Tea Act. Protests sprung up in every city that the British East India Company brought tea to. The consignees resigned and the ships were sent back to Britain. But in Boston, the governor refused to back down. His sons were the tea consignees in Boston, and he talked them into not resigning. Samuel Adams had a meeting with thousands of Bostonians to discuss the fate of the tea ship Dartmouth that sat in the Boston harbor. The meeting passed a resolution. The ship's captain would go back to Britain without getting the import duty money, but the governor would not let the ship leave. 2 other ships arrived loaded with tea. Another meeting led by Samuel Adams had 6,000 people in attendance. The population of Boston was 16,000. They received word that the governor would not allow the ships to leave. What would happen next would be known forever as the Boston Tea Party. After the meeting, a group dressed in Mohawk Indian costumes boarded the tea ships and threw 92,000 pounds of tea into the harbor, and they destroyed what they could on the ships. The damage and lost tea was worth over $1.5 million in modern currency. Another ship's tea was in a warehouse. The Sons of Liberty broke into the warehouse and destroyed the tea. They tracked down more tea to a store that had purchased some of the tea in the warehouse. More men dressed like Mohawk Indians threw the rest of it into the harbor. The British Crown was appalled by the Boston Tea Party and wanted the Americans to suffer consequences. The British government closed the port in Boston, and the Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. This took away Massachusetts' right to self-govern. This sparked concerns in the other colonies, and in 1774, the First Continental Congress met, 12 of the 13 colonies, 56 delegates, after the British Navy blockade of Boston Harbor. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress formed and local militias trained. Massachusetts was declared in a state of rebellion by the British government. We find that a part of your Majesty's subjects in the province of Massachusetts Bay have proceeded so far to resist the authority of the supreme legislator that a rebellion at this time actually exists within the said province. General Thomas Gage, the military governor, was in charge of 3,000 soldiers in Boston. Outside of Boston, the Provincial Congress was in charge of the rest of the state, but not Boston. The militia had stores of gunpowder, weapons, and supplies, and Minutemen had been training in the surrounding areas. General Gage gave orders to Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith on the evening of April 18, 1775, to proceed from Boston with utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores. But you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property. The militia received word that the British would be headed to Concord on April 19th. Paul Revere learned of the potential British operation to Concord and set off on his midnight ride. Samuel Prescott finished the ride into Concord to warn the town. William Dawes rode into Lexington. The gunpowder and supplies were moved to other towns. The militia were readied in preparation for the British march to Concord. 350 grenadiers and 320 light infantry. Officers who volunteered were assigned to lead the companies who they were not familiar with. The British prepared late on the night of the 18th, traveled by boat, then began the march early on the 19th at around 2 a.m. The men did not have a full kit since they would not be gone overnight. The men carried their rations, extra ammo, muskets, and canteens. While marching, the soldiers heard sounds of the alarm coming from the colonial militia. Their cover was blown. They asked for reinforcements from Boston at around 4 a.m. Around 80 militia had arrived at Lexington on the 18th and waited at Buckman Tavern for the British to arrive. They received the information they were waiting for. After 4 a.m., a rider arrived. He spotted the British in large numbers heading for Lexington. The militia waited at Lexington Common. Then, at sunrise, the British arrived and saw the militia lined up. The British advance guard approached the militia in formation. A British officer told the militia to disperse and lay down their weapons. Captain Parker, in charge of the militia, had tuberculosis and had a weak and raspy voice. He told his men to disperse. Some did not hear the orders, and a few did and walked away with their weapons. Men started shouting, and confusion filled the ranks. A shot rang out. No one knows what side fired the first shot. Both sides say the shot did not come from the men on the commons. It's believed that after the first shot, a few fired on both sides, and then the British fired volleys at the militia. They did not have time to reload and fire, so many began to retreat. The British charged the militia with bayonets. 1 British soldier was wounded, and 8 militia lay dead. John Brown, Samuel Hadley, Caleb Harrington, Jonathan Harrington, Robert Monroe, Isaac Muzzy, Ashiel Porter, and Jonas Parker. Jonathan Harrington was wounded and died at his doorstep, unable to make it inside. The British officers lost control of their men, but Colonel Smith arrived and restored order. They then marched to their original destination, Concord. At Concord, the militia received word about what happened at Lexington. Some marched to meet the British, but they retreated when they saw the numbers that the British had. The militia withdrew from Concord to a safe distance a mile away, and they watched the town and waited for the British to arrive as more and more Minutemen arrived. When the British arrived in Concord, they set up a perimeter. 4 companies went to search Barrett's farm, a few miles away. 3 24-pound shot cannons had been buried at a tavern, and the British knew. The Loyalists had told them where it was. The British destroyed what they could from the large guns. Cartridges were found and burned. The meeting house caught fire, and a 71-year-old woman, Martha Moulton, begged the soldiers to put out the fire, fearing that the whole town would go up in flames. This worked. The British soldiers threw buckets of water on the fire, extinguishing it. Food stores and 500 pounds of musket balls were thrown into the mill pond, which the colonists later retrieved. At Barrett's farm, the soldiers did not find much. The militia, numbering at around 400, saw the smoke in the town and headed closer to investigate. They saw a small number of British in the town and saw 90 British gathering at the North Bridge. They decided to advance towards the British, but they would not fire their weapons unless fired upon first. The British retreated across the bridge as the militia advanced. The British officer ordered the men in street firing positions. Somebody fired a shot. Possibly a British soldier. More shots rang out. Then the British in the front fired, but no orders were given. 2 Minutemen were killed. Private Abner Hosmer and Captain Isaac Davis. The militia fired. 3 British privates were killed, Thomas Smith, Patrick Gray, and James Hall. The British retreated, leaving their dead and wounded. The militia also retreated to a hill after the volleys, surprised at what had happened. The British at Barrett's farm were now cut off, but they safely made it back to Concord. The militia had let them pass, but they saw the dead as they passed the bridge. Word spread to militiamen in the surrounding areas. The British did not leave until noon. Lieutenant Colonel Smith ordered some of his men off to the sides to protect the column. The British all gathered in a column, now 3 men wide, and crossed a bridge over Elm Brook. There were militia everywhere firing from a distance. After they crossed the bridge, the rear of the column fired at the militia. They returned fire, killing 2 British, and even more were wounded. 500 militia were waiting at Brooks Hill to fire on the British. The British in the front of the column turned off and charged the militia on the hill, but received many casualties. They quickly withdrew and continued to march back to Boston. In Lincoln, more militia were waiting at Brooks Tavern. They received heavy fire at the Bloody Angle, a curve in the road through a wooded area. Militia were firing from both sides, and more were coming up from behind. More waited down the road at another curve and began firing on the retreating British column. The British reached open ground and outpaced the militia. They inflicted more casualties on the militia, but the lightly equipped British were now running out of powder and ammunition. They were ambushed before reaching Lexington by militia on the surrounding hills. More and more militia took shots at the British on the road, and the British suffered more and more casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was wounded in the leg. Major Pitcairn took command. His horse got spooked and threw the major to the ground, hurting his arm in the process. The casualties were mounting, and the British were exhausted. They were very low on supplies. Some of the British surrendered. Others ran as fast as they could towards Boston. The officers fixed bayonets and threatened the soldiers to form up and continue to march. They reached Lexington at 2:30 and met the British reinforcements that had been requested nearly 10 hours earlier, 1,000 men with artillery. The militia now kept back, not willing to get close to the almost 1,700 British force with artillery. The British had time to catch their breath, and then they headed off again at 3:30. The militia were still taking shots at the column, but it was fought back much easier now with fresh troops in large numbers. Some militia had horses and chased the British down along their entire retreat, continually getting ahead of the column. The surrounding countryside provided food and ammunition for the militiamen. House-to-house fighting erupted in Metatomy, with militia sharpshooters picking off soldiers from the windows. The British commanders lost control of their men, and many unarmed civilians were killed. Taverns were looted by the British. The men took liquor and killed some of the patrons. The militia stood their ground at Watson's Corner. The British inflicted heavy casualties with artillery. The militia tried to take Prospect Hill, but the artillery succeeded in keeping them at bay. A group of militia could have cut off the British, but stopped short at Winter Hill. Once the British reached Charleston, a final attack for the militia poured in, but the gunship and fresh troops stopped any more attacks. 15,000 militia from all over the neighboring colonies surrounded Boston on the 20th. The Second Continental Congress took many of these men into the Continental Army later on. This battle would be the first in what would soon become the Revolutionary War, a huge part in American history. If the British did not occupy Boston, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord never happened, who knows what America would look like today. I want to thank y'all for watching this, folks. I really hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.